If you are leading a multicultural network or an ethnicity network, any ethnicity, so a network for people of colour, and you are based in the UK or in the US, then this video is for you. If you're anything like the UK, so I'm recording this in August, just after the August bank holiday. So if you're in the UK, you will know that there have been protests up and down the country, anti-immigration / anti-migrant protests. And so that is what I'm talking about today. It has taken me forever to record this video, but today is the day. So this is ERG Strategy, the channel that helps you with tips, tools and strategies to build empowered employee networks, employee resource groups that make a difference. So if that's what you are interested in, I've been trying to put videos out every Tuesday, I'm going to say, but I had issues with an editor, but hopefully we are now back in the swing. And then obviously there are always the live videos from my Friday morning live on LinkedIn. So let's get into this. Part of what inspired this video, we had the ERG Leader Summit here in the UK in June, and we had a number of ERG leaders from the US. And there were a lot of conversations and questions about the state of immigration and ICE, which you all know is the immigration enforcement in the US. And we specifically had a question around how to support ERG members and colleagues who are fearful of what is literally going on in the streets, as in people being picked up off the streets and deported, sometimes incorrectly, right? So that question came up at the ERG Leader Summit, and I know it was a real moment. You know, we just happened to be having a panel that was talking about very difficult, very tricky topics, and I'm actually quite pleased that we created a safe enough environment for somebody to ask that question. But as you'll know, the last video that I did and the one that's going ahead of this one, I'm really going to be diving into how you navigate some really tricky political discussions and topics that come up at work, because as ERG leaders, you don't have the luxury of just ignoring these things, right? They really do impact on the community. So I've talked a little bit about the US. If you're here in the UK, I would say for about maybe the last 6-7 months, there's been a real wave actually of anti-immigrant and actually sort of like Islamophobic kind of a wave that's been sweeping across the country. So these things are coming up in conversation, and unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your political persuasion, they're coming up now more in mainstream politics. So now all of the, if I talk about the 3 main political parties in the UK, are all talking about how they are going to tackle illegal migration, you know, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. So I wanted to really come on here and just give you some tips around when those conversations are coming up, and or dealing with things like the impact of some of these anti-migration, anti-immigration protests as well. What does that look like? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about what are some of the common points of disagreement. So why do these conversations get a little bit difficult? I want to talk about some of the lessons that we can take from history. This is not the first time that immigration or migration has been, I would say, almost like used as a political tool, a political weapon, has been politicized, etc. So what are some of the lessons from history? I'm then going to talk about how you can potentially find common ground, and that's potentially within the members in your network, but also if you have allies or people in the organization that approach you as an employee resource group leader and they want to talk about this, or just giving your members the tools and the tips to be able to have these conversations with some of their colleagues and their team members. And then obviously we're going to finish on an actionable takeaway. So let's start with the common points of disagreement. Apologies if you see me squinting, right, to look at my notes, because I can't wear my glasses because they're really reflecting and I want you to be able to kind of like, you know, see the whites of my eyes. Right, my glasses are reflecting. Still haven't quite got this YouTube setup right, but we move, right? That's the reality. It's a bit like running an ERG, okay? So what are some of the common points of disagreement in this very tricky topic, which is immigration? And there's also potentially another topic attached to this, which is multiculturalism, which I may touch on, but that we may leave that for another video. So first of all, and interesting, I was literally listening to the news here in the UK this morning, and I heard this, right? The economic impact of immigration, and this is a common point of disagreement. So you will have many people on different sides of the political spectrum, and some will be like, migration is great for the economy because, you know, people come in, they maybe come in and they may come in as students, for example, so they come over on a student visa, they then work, they contribute to society, or they create businesses. For example, we know that a high proportion of migrants create businesses, right? Lots of facts around that. We've seen that with some very famous individuals actually in terms of first and second gen immigrants. Elon Musk, we see you, okay? So the economic impact of migration, you get some people that believe that it's really good for the economy and good for the society, and then you get others, and it's a bit like the news report I was listening to this morning, where they want to make the argument that actually it can be a drain on the economy. And you know, certainly, I guess if you were to look at just some of the headlines that are pushed out by the media, and obviously it depends on which media you're watching, but you may see things like, you know, the cost of housing asylum seekers or refugees, or somebody might be talking about the strain on the local infrastructure in terms of education and healthcare, for example. So it's a common point of disagreement. You know, my approach whenever it comes to common points of disagreement, I'm always like, what are the facts? Let's go to the facts. I've got a colleague at the moment who is navigating this, very much trying to navigate these conversations, and often we are bouncing messages between each other, sharing different reports, different statistics where people are basically kind of debunking and getting below the headlines to kind of be like, what are the facts and what are the stats? And that can sometimes help with these areas of common disagreement. So rather than just going round and round and round the same old circles and people talking without necessarily knowing the facts, you know, get into the detail, go and look up some statistics from reputable sources. Okay, that can help, because, you know, one of the dangers about some of these sensitive conversations is they can very quickly become heated. But one of the ways to take the heat out of the conversation is to maybe say to the other person, shall we share some statistics? Shall we do some looking for the facts and the figures, and then let's have a conversation when we've found some stats, and then maybe see whether we can find some common ground in what we see. One of the other common points of disagreement is, and I want to touch on this a little bit, it is this point around how well people can integrate, how well migrants can integrate into a society, and also the impact that that has on the society in terms of the ability to either preserve a culture and preserve the ways of being that that culture and or that country has known, versus the potential benefits of having subcultures that don't assimilate, or the importance of having cultures that completely assimilate, right? It's apologies, really quite nuanced, right? The conversation about, you know, what really matters in terms of cultural integration, assimilation, and cultural preservation. But it's a big source of contention in terms of, you know, we hear it very much in the UK, and you hear it in the States as well, where people talk about, you know, retaining what makes the country great, right? Retaining what makes America great, or retaining what makes Britain great. I mean, within Britain, people talk about England, you know, so people talk about the countries within the UK or within Britain in terms of retaining those elements of culture, I guess, you know. And when you think about it, and it's interesting, you know, as we prepare to, we've just come out of South Asian Heritage Month, and we've probably got, as a network, we've got networks certainly in the UK now preparing to go into Black History Month. And we like celebrating things about our culture, about our heritage. Those are stories that connect us to, you know, a sense of who we are and a sense of our belonging, and maybe connects us to our ancestors, our grandparents, our parents, etc. And there is an element of in those particular countries, in the UK and the US in particular, which have attracted a lot of immigrants, and I'll explain part of the rationale for that. You can see that in that country as well, the individuals that maybe have that heritage, you know, that kind of British heritage, or what is US heritage? That's for another video. What is US heritage, right? But they have this sense of, we want to retain that, you know, in the same way it connects us to who we are, it connects us to our forefathers, etc., and all of those sorts of things. So I think that's where some of this disagreement around whether or not you know, multiculturalism and cultural mixing is or isn't good for a society. I think there's maybe an element in all of us that we like to hang on to those elements of our heritage, right? And, you know, heritage, I feel like, is often said as like a positive word, right? So there is an element of, you know, certain individuals within a society wanting to retain that and feeling that, you know, too many immigrants coming in will actually damage that. One of the reasons, just on that point, you know, one of the other points of disagreement, or something that maybe will come out of the facts, it's certainly something that I realised and was sharing with this colleague, as I was saying to you. When it comes to migration, one of the things that people in the UK say, for example, is, you know, individuals, particularly, say, for example, asylum seekers, some of the people in the UK say, you know, they've travelled through, you know, Greece and or Italy and or France, and they've come across the channel. Why not stay in those safe countries? But interestingly, for both the UK and the US, and there are other countries in that as well, Australia and Canada, one of the reasons that people migrate to those countries is because of the English language. So in many countries across the world, we know that often the business language is English, and we know that in many schools, children are taught English. And so it's perhaps no surprise that then when people are either fleeing persecution or they're looking for a country to make a better way of life, they go somewhere they can speak the language, right? That's all part of the challenge, and that's all part of why migrants are potentially attracted to countries that speak English, right? So that's maybe just something there to drop into the conversation. The other one, which is a real biggie at the moment in terms of a source of disagreement and a real source of contention, and I think I would say less so in the US, but certainly in the UK, this particular angle has been seized on in this whole debate, and that is around fear and concerns around safety. So fear around criminality was a big, was a big talking point for the US elections in terms of, you know, these accusations of immigrants coming across the border that maybe, you know, X, Y, and Z types of criminal. That was a huge part of the US campaigning. And here in the UK, we've got a very, almost like quite an acute situation, but I feel like it started maybe a year ago with the Southport killings, where there is this thing around, you know, if we have asylum seekers or illegal migrants or refugees, they are a risk in terms of safety and crime. And in particular, where that's led to in the UK is a particular focus on the safety of women and girls. So an increased, a supposed increased risk of, in particular, sexual violence against women and girls as a result of, and the media has been making a lot of, for example, asylum seekers or refugees coming from countries, for example, where cultures are different and they perceive there to be a different level of respect and or autonomy or attitudes towards women and girls. And so the argument is, when those men, and there does seem to be a high proportion of men coming in as refugees and asylum seekers, certainly if you look at the headlines coming through the media, with that caveat and a health warning, right, in terms of the mainstream media. So there is this fear-mongering that actually asylum seekers and refugees present a heightened risk to women and girls. This is the argument that is being put forward. I must say, so I've really dug into this, myself and a colleague, we've dug into this, trying to really get into the stats. It's incredibly difficult to do. I mean, I'm hoping that there's going to be more coming out on this in the media so that there can be more informed conversation. But at the moment, it's incredibly difficult to do. I think it's difficult both to prove and to disprove. That's certainly my take on it. I mean, obviously, the fact that if there are a larger proportion of individuals coming over who are male, for example, then that's going to do something to the data anyway, and the probability and all of those sorts of things. But I don't want to get into it because I do not have the facts or statistics. All to say is that this is being pointed out, certainly by those who are anti-illegal migration, or let's face it, some are just anti-immigration, anti-migration, full stop, right? So those are one of the things. One of the things that I want to say, and coming, jumping now into some of the lessons from history, this whole thing of, these foreigners and these strangers are a danger to, our women is, I can't tell you how old a trope that really is. Like, you only need to look back through every wave of migration in almost every country in terms of where there is an influx of outsiders. There is always this cry from the men, right? And it's really interesting. On LinkedIn now, a few people have been tackling this, particularly a few women have been sort of saying, okay, we hear this argument, but actually, okay, what are you individuals doing to actually support this more general issue of violence against women and girls, particularly sexual violence against women and girls, which, some people almost like use the line, it's the low rate of conviction for sexual assault against women and girls in the US and the UK, you would almost think it's legal, right? I'm just going to leave that there, right? So there is generally a problem in both the UK and the US in terms of violence against women and girls, particularly sexual violence against women and girls. And yet, we do hear this very common trope around, oh, these strange men are coming in to do X, Y, and Z. It's incredibly common. And so as part of these conversations, I would encourage you to maybe look into that, look into the history of that in terms of whether it be around Jim Crow and, I mean, we haven't got long enough to even start to talk about, the lynchings that would happen for African-American men if they even so much as looked at a white woman, okay? And that's just an example of, again, these stereotypes and these tropes. And similarly here in the UK, if you were to kind of look back to cases, criminal cases, etc., where this assumption was made about the danger of foreign men or alien men to the kind of the women of the native population as it was assumed. So that's a really common trope, right? I think it's also worth looking at the history of how multiculturalism and how immigration is always weaponized. It's an incredibly powerful political weapon. I mean, in the UK, you only need to look at, for example, Brexit. And there is a really fascinating, if you have time and you're in the UK, there's a fascinating inquiry that was done around Brexit. What did it lead to? How was the campaign run? And it was run by, I want to say it was run by one of the Commons committees maybe. And some of the findings that came out of that was around the misinformation, disinformation that was given around things like, the impact and or cost of, being a part of Brexit, the impact of immigration, etc. If you were to go back, certainly in the UK, and I think it would be the same in the US as well, there are particular elections, particular campaigns over the years in the UK. I can think of some terrible slogans that I don't even want to repeat, that were run really on the basis of, we don't like this wave of migration. So for example, particularly in the 60s and 70s, when there were a lot more black people that had come over from the Caribbean, from Africa, a lot of people that, Asian people that had come over from Southeast Asia, there were a lot of campaigns around not wanting immigration, not wanting people of colour to be in communities, and some political parties, that was how they ran their campaigns, and it wasn't even as straightforward as left and right, because the left were using the same tactics, and we see the same today. So understanding that this is normal, it doesn't kind of take away the pain of it, if I use those words, but it does help you understand where these arguments come from. And I think in the conversations that you have with colleagues and with individuals, you can bring those things up. You can say, this isn't new, we've seen these sorts of things before, this is what happened afterwards, etc. We lived, we all survived, we moved on. So when it comes to finding common ground, which is what I want to move on to next, I always think it's really important to share stories and share experiences of different people, and not just people of colour, and not just people that have come in as asylum, but especially, say for example, here in the UK, and I know also in the US, there are a lot of people that particularly in the US, right, because we know that the only people that were originally in the US are not waspy Americans, right? So but sharing stories of parents that maybe came even from different parts of Europe, right? Came from parts of Ireland, came from, Poland, came from Russia, came from wherever, and what those experiences were for grandparents or even older. What were the experiences? What were the things that they talked about? What were the isms and the discrimination that they faced? Talking about those shared experiences, even for example for people whose parents maybe came across in the Windrush, talking about those experiences and some of the learnings from the hostility of the environment and how some of those challenges were overcome, can create empathy where it maybe previously was not. Okay, so sharing those experiences. Okay, well, so asking the question, okay, well, where are you from? Where are your parents from? Where are your grandparents from? Okay, can lead you into potentially a richer, more empathetic conversation. Another way to find common ground, so it's really interesting whenever it comes to things like, as I say, we've had like South Asian Heritage Month here recently in the UK. We've got Black History Month coming up. Obviously, you've got, Asian, American and Pacific Islanders Month. There's all kinds of months now that we have. And what's really interesting is often in those months, we tend to often bring in food, because food is a massive part of cultural heritage. I'm smiling now because even for me, I cook. So when it comes to, for example, Christmas or other special occasions, I will cook traditional Caribbean food, even though I was born in the UK, right? So food is a big part of our culture. So one of the ways that you can create common ground is to potentially have a cultural day that welcomes all cultures. And by that, I mean include the British culture, include that American culture. So include, if people want to bring, I don't know what is traditional American food, like hot dogs and pretzels? I have no idea, right? What is typical British food beyond fish and chips or a roast and Yorkshire pudding, right? But include all cultures, right? This is, I actually think this is one way to really make a difference. If you can't have a cultural day, maybe liaise with your staff restaurant or your canteen. I know some companies do this really well when it comes to things like Black History Month or South Asian History Month. But what you can do, you can maybe say, right, we're going to have a cultural week or something, or we're going to have a cultural month. Maybe pick the day that people tend to be in the office, and it's going to be like, okay, 1 week it's African, the next week it's East Asian, the next week it's South Asian, the next week it's British, the next week, right? But include all of the cultures, right? Because I think that will help to counter that narrative of we are losing our culture, that narrative of that there is a lack of preservation of culture. So that is one of the things that I would really recommend. And then in terms of, as I always say, when it comes to finding common ground, there's sometimes something about asking people what is it that what are they afraid of, and what are they trying to get to? What are the aspirations? What are the hopes? What are the fears? And what you'll often get to is that you find more common ground in that. So for example, the hope is probably just for you know, a community, a society where everybody gets along, regardless of where they're from. You can't argue with that, right? So you often find common ground in the hopes and fears. So if you're really struggling with a conversation, look for that common ground in the hopes and the fears. What are your fears? You know, the fears around, you know, I want to make sure that, you know, that my family's okay. I want to make sure that my family have opportunity. People tend to share those fears, right? So you can at least find common ground there. And if it means that you only find common ground there and you can't agree on anything else, fine, right? It's absolutely fine to kind of like leave it there for another day, or if they raise the conversation again, right? Obviously, as I said in my last video, if you feel the need to draw a boundary or draw a red line and say, look, this conversation really just isn't good for my mental health, like I'm struggling to have this conversation, then, you know, as I always say, practice the words that you need to use when you know that you need to get out of the conversation. Practice those words so that you're absolutely comfortable saying them, and so that you can say them and move on. So in terms of actionable takeaways, if you are an ERG leader, as I say, you know, if you're planning any kind of like cultural days or anything, think about how you can give a nod to the culture. And that you don't need to necessarily like give up your space, right? Because I know some of you will be thinking like, well, every day is like American History Day, or every day is UK History Day, right? And I get that, but there's something about how do you do the intersection of the two, potentially, is what I would say. And I'm not saying that so say for example, if you're here in the UK and you're about to go into Black History Month in October, I'm not saying that you have to give up part of Black History Month to allow space for British culture to be celebrated. But there is something about the intersection. So for example, I'm talking to an organisation at the moment about how to celebrate being like Black and British, right? So what does that intersection look like in terms of that intersection of culture, which I think is really interesting and does in a way give a nod to the preservation of that culture. The other takeaway that I would give you in terms of actions, you know, I'm always talking about intersectionality and collaborating with other employee resource groups. And if you haven't done already, that is something I would encourage you to do in terms of talking about this particular topic, how it is or isn't showing up. Because even though you're watching this, you may be the multicultural lead, but it could well be showing up in other networks as well. And it's an opportunity for you to potentially find other allies, you know, kind of just like build a little bit of a support base around this. The other action that I want to raise as well, just getting really practical, because I know, for example, here in the UK last year when the riots broke out around immigration and migration, a number of organisations had to take steps to ensure the safety, the health, safety, well-being and welfare of their colleagues. And it is something to think about, because I can guarantee that there may well be some colleagues that maybe because of where they, you know, where their commute is to get into work, whether it's in the office or an operational site, etc., they may be fearful of actually being out on the streets and having to walk nearby these protests, right? So if you haven't already, you may want to have a conversation with your health and safety team, or comms and PR and HR and or operational leadership teams that are looking after some of these colleagues, and say, look, do we just need to risk assess this in terms of how are people feeling? So there is that support, you know, do people need additional support from our EAP, our Employee Assistance Programme? And actually, are we confident that our EAP has the right resources, skill set and capability to support those individuals? And on a practical level, in terms of people's physical well-being when they are either commuting or travelling to and from work, or just, you know, going about life, you know, is there any advice that we should be putting out as a company? And I know that that is something that happened last year as well. So that's about all I've got time for today. If this is something you are struggling with, please do drop me a DM, either here on YouTube or over on LinkedIn, which, as you know, is probably where I'm kind of like more active. So if you want to drop me a DM, you want some support, you want to jump on a call just for me to kind of like listen, I'm more than happy to do that. Yes, praying that you all have very safe and healthy and positively constructive conversations. Take care. Go with grace.